I think when it comes to social justice, and in my experience, particularly the gender identity movement, I think things can be, I think agendas can be pushed forward under the guise of human rights and equality when really they're sort of infringing upon other people's rights and harming a lot of people and sort of doing the opposite of what they proclaim to be doing. So I'm a detransitioner, a detransition woman to be specific. I started questioning my gender when I was very young. I think I was around 5 years old. The first time I remember asking my mom if it was possible to change gender. And, I had a lot of things going on in my life at that time that made me feel uncomfortable in my body, made me feel like unsafe being a girl. I struggled with bullying. I suffered some abuse at a very young age. So I think it had to do with that, and also just sort of the gender roles that were being portrayed to me of what I was supposed to be like as a girl or as a woman, and they made me feel very uncomfortable. So yeah, but back then, so I'm a bit older than some of the kids transitioning now. I'm 31. So back then it wasn't like being taught in schools that you could be transgender. Um, it wasn't ubiquitous like it is today. So I didn't even find out about trans people or anything until I was around 13 years old, from an online forum, actually. I don't know if you want me to go into my full story right now, but I ended up not transitioning as a child or as an adolescent because I was not affirmed by my doctors or by my parents or peers, which is something that was painful, but I'm now very grateful for. And I'm sure I'll get to why that is. But I ended up transitioning as an adult and later coming to detransition. And so now I'm living as my biological sex. I consider myself a detransition woman. And if anything, I feel like my mental health is better than it has ever been after detransitioning.
So you started to have these questions when you were 5, and then at what age did you start to proactively take the steps to transition? How old were you at that point?
So when I was 13 and I found this website online, and it actually still exists. I'm writing an op-ed right now about this, and so I was researching yesterday, and it's called ftmguide.com. And so I discovered this website at 13 years old, and it has everything from finding how to pass as a man, if you're born female, and the surgeries you can get, just various things, a lot of which is not appropriate for a child. But anyway, after discovering this website, I pretty much already had the sense that my parents would not approve of me medically transitioning. For some reason, I just sort of took it as at face value that it was something I would do as an adult. But I did begin binding my chest. I began using an ace bandage at first, which is like very unhealthy for you. And I continued binding on and off for the next 15 years. So in the beginning, it was more of like I used non-medical means in the beginning, and I attempted to transition socially. I came out to some of my peers. I came out to my parents who didn't really affirm me. And, I'm a 5'2", very small boned, very feminine looking woman naturally. So it was just not possible at all for me to pass as a boy. If anything, sometimes people would read me as like a 12-year-old boy, which is not what I wanted. I wanted to be seen as my age. So yeah, for the next like 15 years, I kind of just went through these periods. It was like a pendulum swing where either I'd be, actively trying to transition, but wasn't really able to without the medical means, or I was like trying to be a girl, trying to be a woman, and, sort of just because back then it was hard to be gender nonconforming. It was not like celebrated more like it is today. So yeah, I just kind of flip-flopped for a long time, and it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I finally decided, okay, I've tried everything else, and I thought it was impossible for me to be happy as a woman, and so I decided to finally try the testosterone.
During this period in your life, what types of messaging were you getting in terms of affirmation or encouragement? Were were you active in social media? Were you in some types of clubs, or like what was the social support you were getting? How would you describe that?
So when I was a teenager, it was again very different than it is today, but I basically gravitated towards these websites that I was visiting, the FTM Guide and some other ones that had forums where I could read, mostly trans adults talking to each other. And, you know, sometimes I would contribute comments of my own, but more often I was honestly just reading and like informing myself. And I was getting into this mindset and just sort of, you know, this ideology that, you know, female or woman is like a gender role. Same thing with man. Like it's not a biological reality. It's just a gender role. And, you know, if you feel that male gender stereotypes fit you better, then maybe you're like actually a man in a female body, and just all this stuff that now after breaking out of it, it sounds really crazy to me and nonsensical. But as a teenager, you know, learning about gender dysphoria, which was called gender identity disorder back then, I really felt like that just was the answer to all of my problems. And that's very appealing as a young child. So in the beginning, it was very much just online for me. It wasn't like today where it's being taught in schools. You know, my peers were not, if anything, the bullying got worse when I started to dress more gender nonconforming. So it was really hard. I didn't really have any outside help with it. I got some help for my eating disorder because that ended up getting really serious. But when I was 17, it became clear that my dysphoria wasn't just going to go away. And so I asked my parents to take me to a gender therapist. And that was the first time that I really experienced like affirmation. But then, you know, throughout the next like 10 or so years after that, I watched the climate rapidly change around that, to the point where when I was at university, it was being taught as part of the curriculum. And, you know, in classes, you would go around and say your pronouns to everyone. And so I think that was a large part of, you know, why I ended up actually deciding to medically transition later, is because of this changing climate around gender ideology.
So some time went by and you felt more and more that you wanted to go through the process of transitioning to live a life as not only to present, but to live a life as a male, I'm understanding. And tell us about that process and what steps you began to take, and how you're feeling along that path.
So the medical part, it did take me a long time to start. It was a lot of deliberation, and part of that was also my singing voice, because I had been singing with my family since I was around 7 years old, doing professional gigs. I was starting to write my own music by age 13. I had produced my first album. And so my voice was very important to me, my singing voice. So that was another factor in it, because I knew the testosterone would change my voice. But the first time testosterone was ever brought into the conversation, for those who don't know, testosterone is usually the first step for most females wanting to transition to male. It's not always the first step, but I'd say most frequently that's what it is. And so when I was 17 and my parents took me to this gender therapist, he actually suggested I start testosterone by the third appointment. And you know, at 17, part of it was my parents didn't affirm me. I didn't feel I had enough support, but also just something felt fishy about it to me. Like I felt like this man was not really listening to me. Like I had so many comorbidities, and I just didn't feel like he was taking those into account. Because although I wanted to transition, like I did want to make sure there wasn't like another solution, or you know, I guess I wanted to just really talk to someone who knew what they were talking about and like put on the brakes a little bit. And he was just like affirmation, affirmation. So when I was, I think 23, yeah, I think I was 23, I went to a gender clinic. I think at that time they did do some blood work and they prescribed me testosterone, but I had to like inject it myself. And I did like one dose, but it was the intramuscular, and they had prescribed me like this mega dose. So it was like this long needle, like probably this long. And you're injecting. I mean, it was just horrifying for like someone who, I didn't have any experience with like medical stuff. And just so I did do one dose, and I was just terrified I was gonna like hit a vein. My heart was like pounding. And so after that, that kind of like deterred me from doing any more. So yeah, that was 23. And then again when I was 28. So at that point I went through Planned Parenthood because I at that point knew that they were providing gender services. So I called them and I talked to the receptionist and I said, yeah, I'm looking for like gender affirming care. I'm ready to start the process. And like I thought the process would be like maybe some psychological appointments, maybe some blood work, at least like, a physical, like medical evaluation. And she was like, okay, well, I'll have the doctor call you back. And the doctor called me back maybe a day later. And we talked for about 30 minutes. She just asked me some really basic questions. And I'm using the term she, I'm using the pronoun she quite liberally here because I think this was someone who was trans identified as well. But so yeah, it was just a very relatively short conversation. She brought up a few risks of testosterone, but really the way it was played off is like, oh, you shouldn't smoke, like that's bad for you, like don't smoke if you're taking testosterone, don't drink too much alcohol, but like that's what doctors tell you all the time. So I now know that there's a hugely elevated risk of heart attack from taking testosterone as a female, which it was not presented to me that way. Stroke as well. But anyway, I was prescribed over the phone. She ordered some labs, but she did not require me to get them before picking up the testosterone. And, so I ended up picking up my prescription that day and starting shortly after. And yeah, it was just, I mean, honestly, all throughout, it was just unbelievably easy. There was really not a lot of pushback. I never really felt like I got quality mental health care, and even like my insurance covered the testosterone, but it did not cover therapy. So yeah, I did feel like testosterone was my only option, but also I just feel like no other options were really presented to me. So of course I was going to believe that was my best choice.
And so then after you began that, how did you feel initially? And what was the process where you came to change your mind or have regret? Or were there further steps you took as well concurrent with that to transition? Or like what happened the next several months or years?
It was an interesting few months. So the first like month or two, I actually felt amazing. I feel like the testosterone was kind of working as a mood stabilizer and also gave me more energy. So physically, I did feel pretty good the first couple months. I was happy.
That's common, right?
Yeah,
Introduction of testosterone artificially into the body can have an initial mood enhancing effect, from what I understand.
definitely. I've heard that from a lot of other women who have transitioned and detransitioned that initially, it varies from person to person. Some people felt good for a few months to even like a year. For me, it didn't really last long. But yeah, there is a honeymoon period where some of the positive effects are manifesting, but some of the health side effects have not set on yet. So that's what happened with me. I was also excited about, getting stronger. Like I used to be a exercise instructor at a gym, and I've always been into fitness. So I was like lifting weights and I was getting stronger so much faster. And that was really exciting to me. My voice was sort of slowly deepening in the beginning, like it was like just gradually gaining more and more low notes. And that was exciting to me because I did want my voice to deepen. I was excited about having like a male singing voice and what that would sound like. So at first it was like very exciting, and I had some trans friends who were really encouraging. Like I had one best friend in particular who, had told me how much happier he was after his transition. And I really kind of modeled after him in a way because he and I had struggled with some of the same issues like prior to transitioning. And so he was like a beacon of hope to me.